The smoke-filled tavern on Nexus Station buzzed with the usual mix of traders, smugglers, and mercenaries from across the galaxy. Beings of every conceivable shape and size crowded around tables, sharing drinks and stories that grew more impressive with each telling. At the center of the largest group sat Crix, a Zelthanian whose scales gleamed under the dim lighting as he gestured wildly with his forearms. "So there I was," Crix announced, his voice carrying over the ambient noise, face to face with not one but 3 humans on Kepler 442b. Deathworlders, every one of them. You know what they call that place? Earth-2. Can you imagine? The crowd around him leaned in, eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and horror. Humans were legendary throughout the galaxy, whispered about in the same breath as black holes and supernovas. Deathworlders from a planet so hostile that simply existing there required abilities that defied galactic norms. "What did you do?" asked a nervous Quillian, her feathers rustling with anticipation. Crix puffed out his chest, all 4 hands now gesturing dramatically. "What did I do? I did what any sensible hunter would do. I eliminated the threat." He paused for effect, savoring the gasps from his audience. 3 shots, 3 kills, clean and efficient. The galaxy is a little safer thanks to hunters like me. A blue-skinned Andromedan shook his head in amazement. 3 humans? At once? That's incredible. I heard just 1 human once held off an entire Vorthan raiding party for 6 standard hours. Exaggerations? Crix waved dismissively. Sure, they're tough for Deathworlders, but they're still just biological entities, flesh and bone. A well-placed plasma bolt ends them just like any other creature. From a corner table, barely visible in the shadows, a figure in a plain gray jumpsuit listened quietly. Sarah Chen had been nursing the same drink for an hour, her attention split between the technical manuals spread across her table and the increasingly outrageous stories echoing through the tavern. As a maintenance engineer for the station's life support systems, she was used to being invisible. Most aliens found humans unremarkable when they weren't actively trying to kill you. "Tell us about the time you tracked that human pack leader through the Scorpion Nebula," urged a Centaurian whose crystalline form reflected the tavern's lights like a prism. Crix's scales rippled with pleasure. "Ah, that was a hunt worthy of legend. 47 standard days I tracked him across 6 different star systems. He was clever, I'll give him that. Used every trick in the Deathworlder playbook. But in the end, experience won out." Sarah looked up from her technical diagrams, her brown eyes focusing on the Zelthanian for the first time. She'd seen his type before, all bluster and bravado, trading on reputation rather than reality. But something about his stories struck her as particularly hollow. "The human had holed up on an asteroid mining facility in the belt," Crix continued, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. 37 miners dead, the facility's automated defenses turned into a maze of death. Local authorities wouldn't go near the place. "So what happened?" The Quillian was practically vibrating with excitement. "I went in alone." Crix spread all 4 arms wide. "No backup, no heavy weapons, just me, my hunting rifle, and 40 years of experience tracking the galaxy's most dangerous predators." He paused, letting the tension build. "Found him in the reactor core chamber. He'd been using the radiation as cover, knowing most species couldn't follow him there." The crowd murmured appreciatively. Radiation tolerance was one of the many impossible traits attributed to humans, along with their legendary endurance, pain tolerance, and psychological resilience. "But Zelthanians evolved on a world bathed in cosmic radiation," Crix continued smugly. "What would kill most beings only made me stronger. The human never saw me coming." Sarah's stylus stopped moving across her tablet. She set it down slowly, her movements precise and deliberate. Around the tavern, conversations continued, but she had the predator's ability to focus completely on a single target while remaining aware of her environment. 47 days, she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying clearly through the noise. "That's a long time to track one human." The conversations around Crix's table faltered as beings turned to see who had spoken. Sarah remained seated, her hands folded calmly on the table, but her presence seemed to fill the space in a way it hadn't moments before. Crix's scales shifted to a slightly more aggressive coloration. "Yes, well, humans are notoriously difficult to track. They're cunning in the way that only Deathworlders can be." "Cunning," Sarah repeated, as if testing the word. "And you tracked this one across 6 star systems." "That's right." Crix's confidence seemed to waver slightly under her steady gaze. Like I said, it was one of my more challenging hunts. Sarah nodded slowly. Must have been expensive. Jump fuel, docking fees, provisions for 47 days, and all that time away from other hunts. She tilted her head slightly. What kind of bounty makes that worthwhile? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the tavern, conversations had died down as more beings tuned into the exchange. Crix's scales darkened slightly. The bounty was substantial, he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. How substantial? Sarah's tone remained conversational, but there was something underneath it now. Something that made several aliens unconsciously step back from her table. I don't discuss specific figures, Crix replied stiffly. Professional discretion. Of course. Sarah picked up her stylus again but didn't resume writing. It's just that human bounties are usually posted through the Terran Colonial Authority. Public record. I was curious which one you collected. The tavern had gone completely quiet now. Even the background music from the entertainment system seemed muted. Crix's scales were cycling through colors rapidly now, a sure sign of Zelthanian agitation. Not all bounties go through official channels, he said, his voice pitched higher than before. True, Sarah agreed, but the unofficial ones usually come from criminal organizations. Cartels, slavers, pirates. They don't tend to pay well, and they definitely don't reimburse tracking expenses across 6-star systems. She looked up from her tablet, meeting Crix's eyes directly. In that moment, every being in the tavern felt a chill that had nothing to do with the environmental controls. So I'm curious, Sarah continued, her voice still perfectly calm, perfectly reasonable. If you've really been hunting humans for 40 years, if you've killed dozens of them like you claim. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Then why are you still alive? The question hit the tavern like a decompression breach. Beings who had been hanging on Crix's every word suddenly found themselves reevaluating everything they'd heard, because the terrible logic of it was inescapable. Humans didn't just die quietly. They didn't go gentle into that good night. Every spacer in the galaxy had heard the stories, humans who fought impossible odds, who turned certain death into Pyrrhic victory, who made their enemies pay a price so high that killing them wasn't worth the cost. A human who died took others with them, always. So if Crix had really killed dozens of humans over 40 years. I mean, Sarah continued, her voice now cutting through the silence like a blade. You're sitting here unmarked, unaugmented, telling stories. No scars, no missing limbs, no trauma implants. She gestured vaguely at his pristine appearance. You look like someone who's never been in a real fight in his life. Certainly not someone who's gone toe-to-toe with trained human killers. Crix's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around him, his audience was backing away, their expressions shifting from admiration to suspicion to something approaching fear. Not fear of Crix. Fear of the quiet human in the corner, who had just demonstrated something far more terrifying than any weapon. The ability to think. I've been fortunate, Crix stammered. Good planning, better equipment. Luck, Sarah said softly. That's what you're claiming, 40 years of supernatural luck. She stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. For the first time, the tavern's patrons got a good look at her. Average height for a human, which made her taller than most species present. Unremarkable clothing, no visible weapons. But there was something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, that spoke of coiled potential energy, like a loaded spring waiting for release. You know what I think, Sarah said, walking slowly toward Crix's table. I think you've never seen a human outside of holovids and news feeds. I think you've been telling other people's stories so long you've started believing them yourself. The crowd around Crix melted away as she approached. Suddenly, no one wanted to be between the Zelthanian and the human. I think, Sarah continued, stopping just outside Crix's personal space, you have no idea what a real Deathworlder looks like. The silence stretched between them, pregnant with possibility. Crix's scales had gone completely pale, his forearms trembling slightly. So let me ask you again, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible throughout the entire tavern. If you've really been hunting my people for 40 years. She smiled, and for the first time since the conversation began, she looked genuinely amused. Why are you still breathing? Crix's mind raced as Sarah's question hung in the air like a death sentence. The truth was a jagged thing that cut at his pride, but under the human's steady gaze, the carefully constructed lies of 4 decades began to crumble. The truth was he had encountered humans before, 3 times to be exact. The first time had been 23 years ago on a backwater mining colony in the Outer Rim. Crix had been young then, full of confidence and eager to make his reputation. The job seemed simple enough. A human smuggler had killed 2 hegemony customs officials and fled to the mining world. Local security was offering a substantial bounty for the fugitive, dead or alive. Crix had tracked the human to an abandoned processing facility on the colony's outskirts. He'd approached with all the caution his training had taught him, plasma rifle at the ready, thermal imaging engaged. The facility's power grid was down, leaving it in darkness that should have favored the hunter. He'd found the human in what had once been the facility's cafeteria, sitting calmly at a table with his back to the door. The man appeared unarmed, his hands visible, no apparent threat. Crix had felt a surge of confidence. This was going to be easier than expected. "Don't move," Crix had called out in accented galactic standard. "You're under citizen's arrest for murder of hegemony officials." The human had turned slowly, revealing a weathered face that might have belonged to any middle-aged spacer. Nothing remarkable about him except for his eyes. Those eyes had been wrong somehow, too calm, too aware, like he was seeing something Crix couldn't. "You're the one they sent?" the human had asked, his voice carrying a note of what sounded almost like disappointment. "Just you." "I'm sufficient for the task," Crix had replied, tightening his grip on his rifle. "Stand up slowly and place your hands behind your head." The human had complied, rising from his chair with movements that seemed casual but somehow managed to keep him perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. "Mind if I ask how you found me?" "Thermal tracking," Crix had said, proud of his methodology. "Your body heat signature led me right to you." "Thermal tracking," the human had repeated thoughtfully. "That's clever, must have been quite a trail." "Clear as a beacon," Crix had confirmed. That was when the human had smiled. "Funny thing about thermal tracking," the man had said conversationally. "It works great until someone figures out you're using it. Then they can lead you wherever they want you to go." The words had taken a moment to penetrate Crix's consciousness. By the time their meaning became clear, it was too late. The explosion had come from behind him, charges the human had planted along his projected path. The blast hadn't been meant to kill, just to disorient and temporarily blind his thermal imaging. But in those crucial seconds of confusion, the human had moved. When Crix's vision cleared, he was alone in the cafeteria. No sign of the human except for a small device on the table where he'd been sitting. A thermal projector, Crix realized with growing horror. The body heat signature he'd been following was artificial bait. He'd spent the next 6 hours trying to find his way out of the processing facility, only to discover that every exit had been subtly sabotaged. Not blocked, that would have been too obvious, just made unreliable. Doors that wouldn't quite open all the way. Stairs with loose railings. Corridors where the lighting had been redirected to create blind spots. When Crix had finally escaped, the human was long gone. The bounty remained unclaimed. No one had been killed, but Crix's confidence had been thoroughly shattered. The second encounter had been worse. 15 years ago on a frontier trading post, Crix had been hired by a consortium of Vorthan merchants to deal with a human problem. A lone prospector had discovered a rich vein of rare minerals on an asteroid they'd claimed illegally. When they'd moved to evict him, he'd proven resistant. "Simple job," the Vorthan representative had assured Crix. "One human alone on a rock in space, probably half mad from isolation by now, just needs to be removed." Crix had approached the asteroid in his hunting ship, confident that this time would be different. He'd learned from his previous mistakes. No thermal tracking this time, visual confirmation only, multiple escape routes planned, heavy armor and his best weapons. The asteroid's surface was a maze of mining equipment and prefabricated structures connected by pressurized tunnels. Crix had landed at what appeared to be the main operations center and begun his systematic search. He'd found evidence of the human everywhere. Personal belongings, work schedules written in Terran script, even photographs of what appeared to be family members back on Earth. But no sign of the man himself. 3 hours into his search, Crix had begun to feel like he was being watched. It started as a subtle sensation, easily dismissed as paranoia. But as time passed, the feeling grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Equipment appeared to have been shifted slightly from where he'd seen it before. The first trap had been almost elegant in its simplicity. A tunnel junction where the lighting had been redirected to create a blind spot exactly where someone might take cover while observing. When Crix had investigated, a carefully balanced tool rack had collapsed, pinning his rifle arm and triggering an alarm that echoed through the entire facility. The second trap had been psychological. As Crix struggled to free himself, speakers throughout the facility had activated, filling the tunnels with what sounded like human laughter. Not maniacal or threatening, just genuine amusement, as if someone was watching a particularly entertaining holovid. The third trap had been the worst. When Crix finally freed himself and retrieved his rifle, he'd found a note waiting for him in the next junction. Written in careful galactic standard, it had said simply, "You're breathing my air." The words had sent a chill through Crix's nervous system, because they were true. The atmospheric processors were under the human's control. Every breath Crix took was a gift from his supposed prey. He'd left the asteroid immediately, reporting to his employers that the human had already departed. The lie had been easier than admitting that he'd been completely outmaneuvered by a lone prospector armed with nothing but mining equipment and an intimate knowledge of his environment. The third encounter had been 6 years ago, and it still gave Crix nightmares. He'd been part of a hunting pack, then 5 experienced predators hired to track down a human military advisor who'd gone rogue after witnessing atrocities committed by the government forces he'd been training. The human had stolen a ship full of sensitive intelligence and disappeared into the wild sectors. The pack had cornered him on a derelict space station in an abandoned system. 5 of the galaxy's best hunters against 1 human, the odds should have been overwhelming. They'd found the human in the station's central hub, apparently trying to repair an escape pod. He'd been alone, lightly armed, clearly exhausted from weeks of running. An easy target. The pack leader, a veteran Korvaxi named Thector, had called for surrender. The human had looked up from his work, assessed the situation with those unnervingly calm eyes all humans seem to possess, and made a simple statement. "I'm not going back." What happened next defied everything Crix thought he knew about combat. The human hadn't tried to fight 5 trained killers. Instead, he'd fought the environment itself. Somehow, in the brief time between arriving at the station and being cornered, he'd gained access to its systems. The gravity plating began fluctuating wildly. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, dividing the hunting pack. Atmosphere began venting from strategic locations. Thector had been the first to die, crushed when a maintenance hatch he'd been using for cover was explosively sealed by the station's safety protocols. The second hunter had been caught in a decompression event that the human had somehow triggered selectively. The third had simply disappeared into the station's maze of maintenance tunnels and never been seen again. Crix and the remaining hunter had retreated to their ship, battered and demoralized. As they'd prepared to leave, the human had opened a communication channel. "Tell your employers," the human had said, his voice calm despite having just killed 3 trained assassins, "that some things are worth more than money." The stolen ship had launched from the station's far side while they were still trying to restart their own engines. The human had been long gone before they could pursue. Now, sitting in this tavern with Sarah Chen's question echoing in his mind, Crix felt the weight of those failures pressing down on him. The truth was that he'd never successfully hunted a human. He'd never even come close. Every story he told was borrowed from other hunters' accounts, embellished and modified until they became his own victories in his mind. The reputation he'd built was nothing but carefully constructed fiction. Crix began, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah waited patiently, her expression unchanged. Around them, the tavern held its collective breath. "I survived," Crix said finally, the words coming out like a confession, "because they let me." The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Crix's scales had gone completely colorless, and his 4 arms trembled as the weight of his confession settled over the tavern. Around him, beings who had looked at him with admiration moments before now stared with a mixture of disgust and horrified fascination. Sarah nodded slowly, as if she'd expected exactly that answer. "They let you live," she repeated softly. That's what we do, you know. When something isn't actually a threat, we tend to ignore it rather than waste energy eliminating it. The words cut deeper than any blade could have. Crix felt something inside him crumble completely, not just his reputation, but his understanding of his place in the galaxy's food chain. I should go, he mumbled, starting to rise from his seat. Should you? Sarah asked, and something in her tone made him freeze halfway to standing. I mean, you've been telling these beings that humans are just another kind of prey animal. Might be educational for them to see what we're actually like. She moved then, and suddenly every creature in the tavern understood why humans were classified as apex predators. It wasn't anything dramatic. Sarah simply walked to the bar to order another drink, but the way she moved was like watching liquid mercury flow uphill. Every step was precisely placed, her weight perfectly distributed, her balance never compromised for even an instant. She navigated through the crowded tavern without seeming to pay attention to obstacles, yet somehow never bumped into anyone or anything. Another synthalcohol, she told the Rigelian bartender, her tone conversational. Something with fruit flavoring. The bartender, a blob-like creature whose species was known for their steady nerves, was visibly shaking as he prepared the drink. His gelatinous form kept losing cohesion and reforming. On the house, he managed to say, his translator struggling with his agitated state. That's kind, Sarah replied, accepting the drink. As she lifted it to her lips, her hand moved with the kind of precision usually seen in surgical robots. Not a drop spilled, not a tremor in her grip. Behind her, a drunk Cantorian had been arguing loudly with his companion about cargo rates. The argument was escalating toward violence. Cantorians were notoriously aggressive when intoxicated, and this one was reaching for what looked like a vibrashiv. Sarah didn't turn around, she didn't even seem to be paying attention. But somehow, as she raised her drink, her elbow moved in a slight arc that intersected perfectly with the Cantorian's wrist. The contact was barely perceptible. It looked like an accident, a slight bump in a crowded bar. The vibrashiv clattered to the floor, and the Cantorian found his entire arm numb and useless. He stared at his hand in confusion, flexing fingers that no longer responded properly. Sarah continued drinking as if nothing had happened. Pressure point, she said quietly to the bartender, who had witnessed the entire exchange. Temporary paralysis. He'll have full function back in about 20 minutes. The bartender's form wobbled even more violently. You! How did you know he was armed? You weren't even looking. I was listening, Sarah said simply. Different species make different sounds when they're preparing for violence. Cantorians' breathing changes, their body chemistry shifts, their pheromone production increases. You can smell it if you know what to look for. She took another sip of her drink, then turned to face the tavern. Her movement was casual, unhurried, but it put her in a position where she could see every corner of the establishment while keeping her back to a solid wall. Environmental awareness, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent tavern. Basic survival skill where I come from. You learn to process multiple sensory inputs simultaneously, to identify threats before they develop, to maintain tactical advantage even in social situations. A Thraxian near the far wall shifted nervously, his carapace clicking. The sound made Sarah's head turn slightly in his direction, though her expression remained relaxed. Fight or flight response, she explained conversationally. Most species have it, but they usually have to choose one or the other. Humans do both simultaneously. We're perfectly capable of carrying on a normal conversation while cataloging escape routes, identifying potential weapons, and assessing threat levels. To demonstrate, she began pointing around the room without looking where she was pointing. Emergency exit behind the Qualarian in the red cloak. He keeps glancing at it. Probably has the same training I do. Ventilation access panel above the card game. Someone loosened the screws, probably for exactly this kind of situation. Fire suppression controls next to the hegemony military recruitment poster, badly placed from a tactical standpoint. But this station's designer obviously prioritized aesthetics over functionality. Every being she mentioned felt a chill run down their spine as they realized she'd identified details they hadn't even noticed themselves. The really interesting thing, Sarah continued, moving away from the bar with that same fluid grace, is that this is all unconscious behavior. We don't think about it any more than you think about breathing. It's just how our brains are wired. She walked toward a table where a group of traders had been playing cards. As she approached, the players instinctively made room for her, though none of them could say exactly why they felt compelled to do so. "May I?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the deck of cards. The dealer, a nervous Altarian, nodded quickly and handed them over. Sarah shuffled the cards with movements that were somehow too fast to follow clearly. The deck seemed to flow between her hands like water, cards dancing in patterns that defied the eye's ability to track them. When she finished, she set the deck down and nodded to the dealer. "Cut whenever you're ready," she said. The Altarian cut the deck with shaking hands. Sarah gathered the cards and began dealing. Each card landed exactly where it needed to be, perfectly aligned, corners precisely squared. The dealing was mechanical in its precision, yet somehow looked completely natural. "7-card stud," she announced. "Aces high, straights, and flushes count." The players looked at their cards. One by one, their expressions shifted from nervousness to amazement. Each of them had been dealt a perfect hand, not winning necessarily, but exactly the cards they would have wanted given their species' mathematical preferences and risk tolerances. "How did you?" the Altarian began. "Pattern recognition," Sarah said simply. "Humans are very good at identifying subtle patterns in complex systems. We see connections that other species miss. It's not supernatural, just a different way of processing information." She stood up from the table, leaving the traders to stare at their impossible hands. "Of course, in a real game, I'd be playing to win. That was just a demonstration of manual dexterity and probability calculation." Crix watched all of this with growing horror. Every casual action, every offhand comment, revealed capabilities that made his boast sound like a child's fantasy. This woman wasn't even trying to be intimidating. She was just existing, and her mere presence was rewriting everyone's understanding of what humans were capable of. "The thing is," Sarah said, returning to her original table, "everything you've seen tonight is completely normal for my species. I'm not a soldier or a special operative. I'm a maintenance engineer. My job involves fixing air recyclers and calibrating gravity generators." She picked up her technical manuals and tablet, organizing them with the same precise movements she'd used for everything else. Human soldiers, actual military personnel, are trained from childhood to optimize these natural abilities. They learn to push their bodies and minds far beyond baseline human capabilities. They study warfare the way other species study art or philosophy. The tablet in her hands might as well have been a weapon, for the way it made every being in the tavern nervous. "So when Crix here claims to have killed dozens of human soldiers," Sarah looked up from her work to meet the Zelthanian's terrified gaze. "Well, it raises some obvious questions about basic logic and probability." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's ambient noise seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "But I'm sure he has his reasons for the stories," Sarah continued, her tone becoming almost gentle. "After all, reputation means everything in the hunting business, and the truth," she glanced around the tavern, taking in the frightened faces and anxious postures. "The truth is that humans don't hunt. We don't need to. We're persistent predators who evolve to outlast our prey rather than overpower it. When we want something dead, we just wait for it to exhaust itself trying to escape." She gathered up her materials and stood, her movements still precise and controlled. "We're patient, we're adaptable, and we never ever give up." Sarah walked toward the tavern's exit, pausing only when she reached Crix's table. The Zelthanian looked up at her with naked terror in his eyes. "The humans you encountered," she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "They let you live because killing you would have served no purpose. You weren't a real threat, just a nuisance. But make no mistake, they could have ended you at any moment they chose. The fact that you're sitting here, unmarked and breathing, isn't a testament to your skill." She leaned closer, and Crix caught a scent that his hindbrain immediately identified as apex predator. "It's a reminder of their mercy." Sarah had reached the tavern's exit when Crix's voice stopped her. It came out as a strangled whisper that somehow carried through the dead silence. "Wait." She turned, one eyebrow raised in mild curiosity. Crix was standing now, all four arms pressed against the table for support. His scales had begun to show the deep purple coloration that indicated profound shame among his species. I can't let this stand," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "My reputation, everything I've built." Is based on lies, Sarah finished calmly. Yes, we established that. No, Crix's scales flashed to bright orange, the Zelthanian equivalent of desperation. I mean, yes, the stories were embellished, but I am a hunter, I have skills, I've tracked and taken dangerous prey across the galaxy. Sarah stepped back into the tavern, letting the door seal behind her. Have you now? The crowd sensed something building in the air. Conversations died completely as beings pressed back against the walls, leaving a clear space around the two figures. The tension was so thick it was almost visible. I challenge you, Crix said, the words tumbling out in a rush. A formal hunt, you and me. I'll prove that humans aren't the apex predators everyone thinks they are. The silence that followed was profound. Several aliens made soft sounds that might have been prayers in their native languages. The Rigelian bartender began rapidly cleaning glasses with nervous energy. Sarah studied Crix for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You want to hunt me? Standard rules, Crix continued, his confidence building as he spoke. Neutral territory, agreed upon boundaries, no outside interference. First to incapacitate or force surrender wins. And what exactly do you think this will prove? Sarah asked. That humans can be beaten, that you're not the unstoppable killing machines everyone says you are. Crix's scales began showing the green striations of renewed hope. When I defeat you, it will validate everything I've claimed. Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering the proposal seriously. And if you lose? I won't, Crix said quickly. But if I do, I'll publicly recant every story I've told, admit that I lied about hunting humans. Interesting stakes, Sarah mused. She looked around the tavern, taking in the expectant faces. I assume you'll want witnesses. Of course, this needs to be properly recorded. Crix was gaining momentum now, feeding off what he mistook for uncertainty in Sarah's demeanor. The hunting preserve on level 7 would be perfect. Environmental controls can simulate any conditions we agree on. Level 7, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. I know it, used to do maintenance on their atmospheric processors. She paused. What kind of environment were you thinking? Crix's scales brightened further. This was exactly the kind of negotiation he was comfortable with. Dense forest, limited visibility, natural terrain with caves and water features. The kind of environment where stealth and tracking skills matter more than brute strength. Your natural element, Sarah observed. Exactly, a fair test of hunting ability versus raw human physicality. Crix was practically glowing now. Shall we say, 4 hours, that should be sufficient time for a proper hunt. Sarah appeared to consider this for several seconds. Around them, the tavern's patrons watched in fascination and horror. Most of them had never seen a human challenged to single combat. The few who had generally hadn't lived to tell about it. 4 hours, Sarah agreed finally. Dense forest environment, standard non-lethal weapons only. I assume you want both of us to survive the experience. Of course, Crix said quickly. Stunning weapons, paralytic darts, perhaps some basic traps, nothing permanently damaging. Very civilized. Sarah's tone remained perfectly neutral. And you're comfortable with the idea that I'll know the territory as well as you do? I did mention maintaining those atmospheric processors. Crix waved a dismissive hand. Mechanical knowledge isn't the same as tactical familiarity. You might know where the air recyclers are, but I'll know where to find cover, how to move silently, where to set ambushes. True, Sarah conceded. When did you want to do this? Tomorrow, Crix said immediately. 1400 station time. Give us both time to prepare properly. Fair enough. Sarah extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. Should we make this official? Crix stared at the offered hand for a moment. Something in his predator's instincts screamed at him not to touch her, but his pride overrode his survival instincts. He reached out with one of his 4 hands and grasped hers. Sarah's grip was firm but not crushing. Her hand was warm, the skin rougher than most species due to humanity's tendency toward manual labor. But what struck Crix most was the complete steadiness of it. No tremor, no tension, no sign of anxiety or aggression. Pleasure doing business with you, she said pleasantly, then turned to address the room. I suppose you'll all want to watch this spectacle. A chorus of eager agreement rose from the crowd. The Altarian card dealer was already working his communication device, probably calling in favors to get good viewing positions. This would be the most entertainment the station had seen in months. Excellent, Sarah said. Just remember recording devices only, no interference from spectators, and have medical teams standing by just in case. She released Crix's hand and moved toward the exit again. This time, she paused at the door and looked back. "Oh, Crix," she called out casually. "You might want to spend tonight reading up on human hunting techniques, not the stories you've been telling, the real ones." "Why would I do that?" Crix asked, still riding high on his confidence. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the conversation began, the expression looked genuinely predatory. "Because humans don't hunt other apex predators," she said softly. "We hunt persistence predators, we hunt pack hunters, we hunt ambush specialists." She paused, letting that sink in. "We hunt hunters." The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving the tavern in stunned silence. Crix stood frozen for several seconds, his mind racing to process what she'd just said. Around him, the other patrons began talking in hushed, urgent tones. "Did she just say?" the Quillian whispered. "Humans hunt hunters," the Andromdan confirmed, his blue skin pale with shock. "That's what she said." Crix felt something cold settling in his stomach. For the first time since issuing the challenge, doubt began to creep into his mind. But it was too late now. The challenge had been witnessed by dozens of beings. Word would spread throughout the station within hours. By tomorrow morning, the entire galaxy would know about the hunt. His reputation, his livelihood, his entire identity, everything depended on winning this contest. As the tavern slowly returned to life around him, Crix tried to ignore the small voice in his head that kept repeating Sarah's final words. "We hunt hunters." What exactly, he wondered with growing unease, did that mean? The next several hours passed in a blur of preparation. Crix spent the night reviewing tactical manuals, checking his equipment, and trying to convince himself that he still held the advantage. He was in his element. He knew how to hunt, how to track, how to kill. But the doubt remained, growing stronger as the appointed time approached. At 1400 station time, Crix stood at the entrance to Level 7's hunting preserve, his gear carefully arranged and his confidence artificially bolstered. Around the viewing platforms, hundreds of beings had gathered to watch the spectacle. Word had indeed spread quickly. This was being billed as the contest of the century. Sarah arrived exactly on time, carrying what appeared to be a standard maintenance kit. She wore the same gray jumpsuit she'd had on in the tavern, with the addition of light body armor and a utility belt. No obvious weapons, no special equipment. "Ready?" she asked pleasantly. Crix nodded, not trusting his voice. The preserve's administrator began explaining the rules to the assembled crowd, but Crix barely heard the words. All his attention was focused on Sarah, trying to read her body language, to find some advantage he could exploit. She looked like she was preparing for a routine work shift. "Contestants enter the preserve," the administrator announced. 4-hour timer begins now." The doors sealed behind them, leaving Crix and Sarah alone in an artificial forest that stretched for several kilometers in every direction. The environmental controls had created a perfect hunting ground: dense vegetation, irregular terrain, natural sounds and smells that would mask movement and scent. For exactly 10 seconds, Crix felt the familiar thrill of the hunt. This was his domain, his expertise. Then Sarah spoke softly into the comm system that connected them. "Game on," she said. And Crix realized with dawning horror that the hunt had already begun. He was the prey. For the first 30 minutes, Crix almost convinced himself that he had been worried for nothing. The forest environment was exactly what he'd requested: thick undergrowth that muffled sound, irregular lighting that created perfect hiding spots, natural barriers that could be used for ambush points. This was the kind of terrain where his species had evolved to excel. He moved through the preserve with practiced stealth, his 4 arms allowing him to navigate dense vegetation without creating disturbance. His natural camouflage shifted to match the forest colors, and his thermal signature was naturally low. Every instinct told him he was the superior predator in this environment. The first sign that something was wrong came when he realized he hadn't seen or heard any trace of Sarah since the hunt began. In his experience, humans were notoriously poor at moving quietly. They were large, relatively clumsy, and their bipedal locomotion made them inherently unstable on uneven terrain. He should have picked up her trail within minutes. After an hour, Crix began to feel the first stirrings of unease. He'd covered nearly a quarter of the preserve, checking all the obvious hiding spots and establishing a clear picture of the terrain. But there was no sign of his quarry. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished. By the 90-minute mark, Crix's unease had transformed into active concern. He'd expanded his search pattern, using every tracking technique in his considerable repertoire. He'd checked for disturbed vegetation, unusual scent traces, thermal residue, even electromagnetic signatures from her equipment. Nothing. It was impossible. No creature, no matter how skilled, could move through this environment without leaving some trace of its passage. The laws of physics simply didn't allow it. Unless... Crix felt a chill run down his spine as an impossible thought occurred to him. What if Sarah wasn't hiding from him at all? What if she was following him? He stopped moving and forced himself to remain perfectly still for several minutes, extending his senses to their maximum range. The forest around him was alive with small sounds, rustling leaves, distant water, the subtle hum of the environmental controls. All perfectly normal, all perfectly innocent. All perfectly wrong. Because somewhere in that symphony of natural sounds, Crix's predator instincts detected something that shouldn't be there. A rhythm that was too regular, too purposeful, like breathing that was carefully controlled to match the ambient noise levels. Someone was watching him. Crix's camouflage shifted involuntarily to darker tones as adrenaline flooded his system. His forearms moved to ready positions, weapons appearing in his hands as if by magic. Every muscle in his body tensed for immediate action. But when he spun to face the source of his unease, he found only empty forest. Paranoia, he whispered to himself. She's just better hidden than expected. But even as he said the words, Crix knew they weren't true. This wasn't about hiding. This was about control. The realization hit him with devastating clarity. He wasn't hunting Sarah. She was hurting him. Every decision he'd made, every path he'd chosen, every hiding spot he'd investigated, they had all been influenced by subtle environmental cues that she had somehow manipulated. A branch positioned just so to block one route and encourage another. Scent markers that suggested safe passage in specific directions. Visual elements that drew his attention away from certain areas. She hadn't been evading his search pattern, she'd been guiding it. For 2 hours, Sarah Chen had been leading him exactly where she wanted him to go. Crix stood frozen in the middle of what he'd thought was a random clearing, his mind racing to understand how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. Around him, the forest suddenly felt less like familiar territory and more like an elaborate trap. That's when Sarah's voice emerged from the comm system, calm and conversational. "You're learning," she said approvingly. "Most prey animals take longer to realize they're being managed." Crix spun in a full circle, weapons raised, but she was nowhere to be seen. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Where are you?" he demanded. "Does it matter?" Sarah replied. "The important question is, where are you?" Crix looked around the clearing with new eyes. It was perfectly positioned at the intersection of 3 major terrain features: a rock outcropping that would limit escape routes, a stream that would mask sounds, and a grove of dense trees that would provide excellent cover for an observer. He was standing in a natural killing ground. "You've been playing with me," he said, his voice tight with growing panic. "Playing is the wrong word," Sarah corrected gently. "I've been teaching you. This is what a real hunt looks like when humans do it. We don't chase our prey until it exhausts itself. That's inefficient. We guide it to where we want it to be, then we wait for it to realize it has no options left." Crix's scales had gone completely pale. This was supposed to be a test of hunting skills. "It is," Sarah agreed. "I'm demonstrating mine, you've been demonstrating yours, the results speak for themselves." A soft rustling from the tree line caught Crix's attention. He spun toward the sound, weapons tracking automatically, but saw only shifting shadows and swaying branches. "The thing about humans," Sarah continued, her voice now coming from a different direction entirely, "is that we've been persistence predators for millions of years. We didn't evolve claws or fangs or natural armor. We evolved patience and intelligence and the ability to turn any environment into an extension of our will." More movement, this time from behind the rock outcropping. Crix pivoted again, his multiple arms allowing him to track several potential threat vectors simultaneously. But every shadow he investigated proved empty, every sound led to nothing. "You know what the most dangerous human weapon is?" Sarah asked conversationally. "What?" Crix gasped, his breathing now rapid and shallow. "Time," Sarah said simply. "We have all the time in the world. We can wait for days, weeks, months if necessary. We can outlast any burst of speed or strength or aggression. We just keep coming, keep adapting, keep learning until our prey has no energy left to resist." Crix felt his strength beginning to ebb. The constant vigilance, the adrenaline surge and crash cycles, the psychological pressure of being hunted by an invisible predator, it was taking its toll. His forearms were beginning to shake with fatigue. "But I'm not actually hunting you," Sarah continued. "This is still just a demonstration. You challenged me to prove that humans aren't apex predators. I'm showing you why that challenge was based on a fundamental misunderstanding." "What misunderstanding?" Crix asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. "You think being an apex predator means being the biggest, strongest, or most aggressive creature in the ecosystem," Sarah explained. "But that's not what it means at all. Being an apex predator means being the one that everything else has to adapt to survive." The forest around Crix suddenly felt different. Where before it had seemed like neutral territory, now it felt actively hostile. Every tree could hide an enemy. Every sound could signal an attack. Every shadow could conceal death. "Look around you," Sarah said softly. "Really look, what do you see?" Crix forced himself to focus, to examine his environment with the analytical mind that had made him a successful hunter. What he saw made his blood run cold. Everything in the clearing had been subtly modified. Branches had been repositioned to create specific sight lines. Rocks had been moved to eliminate certain hiding spots. Even the stream had been diverted slightly to create a water feature that would mask approaching footsteps from specific directions. The entire environment had been weaponized. "How?" he whispered. "How did you do all this in 2 hours?" "I didn't," Sarah said, and for the first time there was amusement in her voice. "I did it in 20 minutes. The rest of the time I've been watching you adapt to the maze I created." 20 minutes, Crix's voice cracked with disbelief. "Humans are very good at environmental modification," Sarah explained. "It's one of our primary survival strategies. We don't adapt to our environment, we make our environment adapt to us. Give us access to basic tools and materials, and we can turn any space into exactly what we need it to be." Crix's weapons drooped in his hands as the full scope of his defeat became clear. He hadn't been outfought or overpowered. He'd been outthought so completely that the contest had been over before it began. "I surrender," he said quietly. The words echoed in the suddenly silent forest. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Then Sarah emerged from the tree line, appearing not 10 meters from where Crix stood. She'd been there the entire time, perfectly concealed by camouflage that wasn't high-tech gear, but simple mud and vegetation applied with an artist's eye for pattern and color. Her maintenance kit lay open beside what had obviously been a comfortable observation post, complete with water, rations, and communication equipment. "That was well fought," she said respectfully, approaching him without any of the caution one might expect when facing a recently defeated predator. "You have excellent instincts and impressive technical skills. Under different circumstances, you'd be a formidable hunter." Crix stared at her, his mind still reeling. "But not against humans." "Not against humans," Sarah confirmed. "But that's not a failing on your part, it's just the way evolution works. Different species develop different survival strategies. Yours is built around stealth and individual excellence. Ours is built around adaptation and systematic thinking." She began gathering her equipment with the same precise movements he'd observed in the tavern. "The stories you were telling about hunting humans, they weren't just lies. They were impossible. Humans don't get hunted individually because we don't exist individually. We're part of a larger system, a collective intelligence that spans our entire species." "I don't understand," Crix admitted. Sarah paused in her packing and looked at him thoughtfully. "Every human you might encounter has access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of every other human. We share information instantaneously across galactic distances. We learn from each other's successes and failures. We adapt faster than any individual organism possibly could." She gestured toward the modified clearing around them. The techniques I use today, environmental modification, psychological pressure, tactical misdirection, those weren't my innovations. They were developed by thousands of human strategists and soldiers over hundreds of years, refined through countless conflicts, and shared freely among our people. So when you hunt a human, Crix began. You're not hunting an individual, Sarah finished. You're hunting the entire human species, and we've been preparing for that hunt for our entire evolutionary history. They walked toward the preserve exit together, the artificial forest somehow seeming less threatening now that the contest was over. Around them, Crix could see evidence of Sarah's modifications everywhere, subtle alterations that had turned familiar terrain into an elaborate control mechanism. "What happens now?" he asked as they approached the doors. "Now you honor our agreement," Sarah said simply. "You tell the truth about your hunting experiences. You stop spreading stories that could get someone killed by making them underestimate human capabilities." Crix nodded slowly. His reputation was destroyed, his livelihood probably ruined. But somehow he found he didn't care as much as he'd expected. "And in return," he asked. Sarah smiled, the expression warm and genuine. "In return, you learn what humans are really like. Not the monsters from your stories, not the victims you pretended to hunt, but the actual people we are." The doors opened, revealing the crowd of spectators who had been watching the entire encounter through the preserve's monitoring system. Their faces showed a mixture of awe, terror, and fascination. "Besides," Sarah added quietly, "someone needs to tell the real stories about human-alien cooperation. The times we've worked together, helped each other, shared knowledge and resources. Those stories are just as important as the scary ones." As they stepped into the viewing area, Crix felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Maybe his reputation as a hunter was finished, but perhaps his career as a storyteller was just beginning. And for the first time in 40 years, he would have true stories to tell.